This one is quite a deceptive question. The one thing that is easy to do here is to make sentence pairs. We can see that statements B and D would be together because they both talk about the strategy. A strategy is being discussed here. These both statements, B and D, talk about the strategy. So those would be in a pair. What would be the order of these statements? That is the tough part, or rather, that is the deceptive part. We'll discuss that in a moment. A and C would also be together because A and C further explain this strategy or define characteristics of the strategy or aspects of the strategy, such as the firm or the niche. So once we have that, they don't necessarily need to be consecutive statements, or they don't need to be a pair, but they would clearly follow B and D. So let's first look at B and D and find out their sequence. B says, in this niche strategy, the firm concentrates on a select few target markets. D then says, it is called a focus strategy as it is hoped that by focusing the firm's marketing efforts on one or two narrow market segments and tailoring the firm's marketing mix to these specialized markets, it can better meet the needs of that niche. We can see right off the bat that these are introductory of the strategy. Both talk about strategy. One calls it a niche strategy, the other calls it a focus strategy. But we have the word this here, which throws us off. By just the word this, as it is used here in statement B, we think that B is actually referring to something, and what it is referring to, it should be in the passage, in these statements. So we begin to think that it is called a focus strategy, which also sounds very introductory. This comes first, and then we have B, which says in this niche strategy. But if we look a little more carefully, if we look a little deeper, dig a little deeper, we'll find that B actually introduces the aspect that is being discussed. Yes, the niche strategy, that is the subject, sure. But then the aspect is that in this strategy, the firm introduced here concentrates on a select few target markets. Now you see, concentrates on a select few target markets is where targeting of markets, of select few markets, the very definition of a niche, that is introduced. And then we have this expanded upon in D, which says this is called a focus strategy. Also, you can connect concentrating on a select, especially the word concentrates on something specifically. This can be connected to focus strategy. So the order we are looking at is from B to C, B to D. D again says it is called a focus strategy because as it is hoped that by focusing the firm's marketing efforts on one or two narrow market segments and tailoring the firm's marketing mix to these specialized markets, it can better meet the needs of that niche. So concentrating on a select few target markets to do what? One, this is done by focusing the firm's marketing effort on these narrow market segments, and then also they require tailoring the firm's marketing mix to these specialized markets. The objective is to better meet the needs of that niche. Essentially, actually, as we see here, it is to gain a competitive advantage, but let's not jump the gun just yet. Let's keep to B and D. So once we've seen these two statements, or we've compared these two statements in a more detailed manner, we find that B comes first and D comes later. So the two statements, they form a pair, but the order is BD, not DB. We can also see that from the idea that B and D form a pair by the general to specific rule. Here we have something very general. Just the selection of few target markets is mentioned. And here we see that marketing is mentioned, the focus on a few narrow segments is mentioned, tailoring the firm's marketing mix, the marketing system altogether is mentioned. It is to cater to these specialized markets. And what is the requirement, the end requirement, that is also mentioned. So even by the general to specific rule, we have B coming first and D coming later. We know that after we have read the statements, we'll realize that A and C, they talk about the needs of this strategy or the characteristics of the strategy, as we've discussed before. So we find that these two statements, they are the first two statements. In that, we have found that the order is BD. So let's place that into sequence. B comes first, and then we have the statement D. Now let's clear this out. We are done with these two statements. Moving to A and C, again, these are not necessarily consecutive statements or in a pair necessarily, but the order of these statements is what matters here. We know, we can tell that these two are in sequence, at least in this particular context, at least for this particular question. But if we focus on words, then we would again be deceived by seeing the firm mentioned here. Here, we already have seen that BD are the opening two statements. So we find that the firm mentioned here in C seems to suggest that C immediately follows D. And that means the order of these two statements should be CA, but that is not so. If you look at A, it says the niche should be large enough to be profitable, but small enough to be ignored by the major industry players. This gives us, first off, this gives us a characteristic of the niche. It should be large enough to be profitable. Let's not look at all of that. Let's focus on the word profitable, but small enough to be ignored by the major players. So the major industry players, again, this is a key phrase. So let's keep our mind on these two phrases, profitable and ignored by the major industry players. These immediately connect with C, which says profit margins are emphasized rather than revenue or market share. And the firm typically looks to gain a competitive advantage through effectiveness rather than efficiency. Once we look at this in that manner, and once we draw the connections, we find there are three parallels with A. Not three parallels, actually, two parallels with A, one connection with the entire passage, and then there is a bit of a change of argument at the end. Let's come to that later. First, we see profit margins are emphasized, which immediately connects with profitability. So that is one connection which we can draw right off the bat. Then again, are emphasized rather than revenue or market share. We see that market share is not emphasized. This also connects with, this also can be connected with A. So ignored by the major industry players because market share is not the concern here. The niche doesn't cater to the larger market share, which is why the larger market share, something that the major industry players would hold and would probably continue to hold, would probably make efforts to hold. That is not our concern here. We want to be small players, but in our own niche, we would be the most powerful entity or the most powerful player. So we find that this immediately connects A to C, and A then connects with B and D because A is talking about the niche. And when B and D have introduced the strategy, which is the niche strategy or a focus strategy, the niche is the next thing to be explained. Then we say the firm typically looks to gain a competitive advantage. Obviously, it's a strategy, it's a business strategy. So clearly for businesses, the primary objective is competitive advantage. But that is done through effectiveness rather than efficiency. Now, if we look at this carefully, effectiveness versus efficiency is a concept that does not directly connect with the niche. What is the connection? We can be sure that once, since this is mentioned here, it has some sort of a connection, but that connection is technical. That connection is relevant to information pertaining to this industry or this field of study. That is not this business industry, not the segment of economy, but this field. Once we look at that, we find that there is no other mention of anything that connects to effectiveness or efficiency. These have not been mentioned or referenced or even suggested anywhere else. So we find that effectiveness rather than efficiency, effectiveness versus efficiency, that is an aspect which is introduced here, and that is a change of argument because we don't see this taken up anywhere else, which makes perfect sense if C comes at the end, because at the end there is something which is a change of argument and will not return to it in any other statement. So whatever the discussion is on the aspect of effectiveness versus efficiency, that comes after these lines, or that comes after the passage that we are looking at. So that gives us an idea that A and C form a pair, and the sequence of these statements is exactly that: A first, then C. So we put that into our sequence. We have A as the third statement, and then we have C as the fourth and final statement. And with that, we have our sequence ready. The correct answer is BDAC.